Well, Orr, thanks for being on the show today. It's a pleasure to have you. If you could just give people a quick 2-minute background. I mean, your history is so interesting, and that's why, I thought it'd be great to have you on the show. But I mean, what is it that you're looking to do right now?
Cool. Well, thank you for having me on the show. My pleasure. So I guess my background comes in a brand side. So I've started off my career at Procter & Gamble, L'Oreal, and then moved into the startup space. And then kind of had a bit of a loss of heart for business world, and actually saw what happened with Brexit. So I jumped into politics and ran for Parliament in 2017. And then after that kind of worked a little bit more on the kind of political side of things, before coming back and realizing that you could actually have business that also does good in the world. And that's what we're focusing on. So we build an accelerator, which is helping the next generation of entrepreneurs build really successful global businesses that also has a positive impact on the world and its stakeholders. So that's kind of where we're at. We're really early doors, but we're kind of opening for applications pretty soon.
Oh, that's very interesting. For me, it's even more interesting because most people think businesses only need to go after sort of the EBITDA, the revenue, and share prices and all that good stuff.
Right.
Why do you think it's important for people to actually want to go for the good or try and look at things that are beyond the sort of metrics? Well, why is that important? Why should they even do that?
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to be just, let's take like the pure capitalist point of view and kind of why you should do this as a capitalist, and then we'll kind of move on. Like in the long run, either governments or consumers are going to stop your activities. So either government are going to tax what you do, and that's the move that governments are going to. And kind of pollution charges are things that, we see already in London, or consumers are going to stop buying your product. And the evidence for that is if you look at kind of millennial or Zoom consumers, they are much less motivated by buying from those kind of big kind of corporates, and they're moving towards buying from more ethical brands. And so you see the kind of proliferation of startup brands, ethical brands, and they're doing much better in the long run. So their returns are actually exceeding traditional businesses now. And so, if you're a big business, why would you not want to go down a route that is that gets you more consumers, gives you less kind of political risk? But then finally, the kind of big point I also make to entrepreneurs and companies is young people, smart young people, have all the choice of where they want to work now. And so if you want to attract the best talent wants to work somewhere that does good, pays well, is doing something interesting in the world. And so, if you're competing for that kind of entrepreneur, employee, you've got to offer something that's a bit more ethical as well in what you do.
You just described it nirvana. If I could have a place that has great pay, is ethical, and meets all those boxes, that would be great. But there aren't those, that many places that can meet all those boxes. Typically what you see is, or at least what I see, is, institutions that want to do good. They don't have that much, money or funding behind them, so they can only afford to pay a little amount in terms of salary or remuneration and things like that. But you're saying that it is possible to sort of have the two?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, there's some big companies that are really obvious to point to, like Patagonia, Lululemon, Innocent, who are kind of quite big now. There's slightly kind of smaller companies behind them now, like All Plants, Tony's Chocolonely, who are coming through in the food and drink space. But you're right, there is a challenge with the number of these businesses. And actually, when I speak to investment managers at kind of places like, Octopus and those kind of investment places, they say, look, there is a gap that there aren't enough of these businesses that are globally scalable coming through. And that's why we exist, actually. So we see that gap. And we want to make sure that entrepreneurs kind of bake into their business model a for good aspect. And so that's our role. We're kind of looking to build the next generation of those businesses, because I agree there aren't enough, but there is the demand for it. And there is also the kind of appetite by employees to go and work for these places as well. So that's what we're in the market to do.
So it sounds like it's a supply problem, right? Like
Absolutely.
There aren't enough people creating scalable businesses that are ethical, that are perhaps profitable, or at least have a path to profitability at some point.
Absolutely.
Right?
That's it. Yeah, you're right. That's it. It's a supply problem. But there is a lot of people who want to start these businesses. And so the challenge for us is just to find those people and give them the right tools so that they can scale. And then when they come to raise investment, so they go for their, whether it's seed or Series A, etc. There are a lot of investment managers who have specific ESG pots that they're looking to deploy. And at the moment, one of their challenges is, look, I can spend money on a wind farm. I can spend money on kind of capital projects. That's really easy for me to do. But I'm looking for these startups. And so they're, not desperate, but they're crying out for these startups. And so what we want to build is that kind of ecosystem. And, there's people like Zinc who also do it. BGV also do it. So there's a few other players in the space, but if you look at kind of how many accelerators and incubators there are, the percentage that focus on that kind of dual bottom line of purpose and profit is still quite small, and so we're quite early on into that kind of proliferation of the space.
Yeah, you got to start somewhere, man.
Absolutely.
Rome wasn't built in a day, as you say, but yeah, I think it's a great mission that you're trying to undergo. One thing I am cognizant of, or at least I've worked in marketing for a little while, so sometimes you can see the sort of utopia that's presented. Oh, we're trying to do good and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then when you do a bit of digging behind the scenes, you start to see that that's not the reality. It's just the way they're marketing it to us. You know what I mean? And so, how do you battle, or how do you balance those two things between presenting yourself in an overly optimistic, hey, we're saving the world, or we're ethical, versus the reality in terms of, if you look at supply chains of maybe some of the clothes manufacturers, right? They're still using sort of slave labor and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the way they present themselves is, oh, we're all about being bold and being amazing and, all that kind of stuff. But they have to compete in the marketplace. So they have to go for the lowest, cost in terms of labor and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So in other words, I'm trying to get to this dichotomy between saying you're ethical, saying that you're trying to do good, but the realities and practicalities of actually running a business, which require you to be a bit ruthless and just go for the bottom line. How do you think you're going to be able to marry those two things? Or do you think there is a way to bridge those two?
Yes, I think there's I'd say there's almost two questions there. One answer I would have is that firstly, so Ronald Cohen is probably the furthest ahead of anyone in the UK in terms of this space. And he's been investing for like 20 years in kind of what we now call ESG. And he's starting to kind of share the results that they're getting. So he's saying, look, I'm comparing this to other kind of investment manager and funds, and we're getting as good, if not better returns. So firstly, kind of there's some evidence from him. Secondly, there's evidence from the Carlyle Group. They just released the report last week. And they're saying they're getting better returns on ESG than on their traditional investments. So, I guess what I'm saying there is that it is profitable to be in ESG or impact investing or whatever term people call it. So there is money there. But in terms of how you make sure that you're keeping honest, I suppose, to the standard, that's something that we are really kind of thinking about really carefully. And so our approach to it is that there are guidelines out there. So there is B Corp, there's Future Fit, there's the GIN methodology. And we have to kind of think of something that's realistic for startups. And so that's basically what B Corp is trying to be. It's trying to be that kind of fair trade stamp on front of the packets, in front of, websites, etc. So they're a very high standard. So we're kind of going through their methodology at the moment, and it's tough. Like they have a serious standard to meet. But what we're trying to build is something that's kind of realistic for brands to take on. And I think the B Corp kind of methodology is probably the best there is out there at the moment. Their biggest challenge is being recognizable. So, like when you go to a supermarket and you see the Taste Award, you know what that is. It's going to be a good product. So they have some work to do on that front, but they're getting there. They're getting there.
Okay. Yeah, no, that sounds interesting. You're a pretty international guy too. I know that you know that standards vary from place to place. Talking about standards, you've been to, Israel, you've worked in Europe for a little while, you've been around the world a little bit. And, in this world that's going to sort of a deglobalized world, it seems like, we had the trend going in one direction, now it's reversing. Do you see that as posing any challenges to what you're trying to do in terms of there's a variance in standards everywhere? Good in Europe might not mean good in Africa, might not mean good in Asia, right? So how do you balance out this difference in global perspective, especially into the world that we're going into? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, firstly, I would say that you're right that the world is becoming deglobalized when it comes to politics and movement of people. But when it comes to capital, the world is becoming even more globalized. So something I read recently is that, the American and the Chinese investment funds now see European and particularly British assets as undervalued because of the fall of the pound. And so you're going to see particularly Chinese funds coming and investing at seed, at Series A stage, like we've never seen before. And so from a kind of movement of capital, we're seeing a much more globalized world. But you're right, politically, movement of people, it's going in the other direction. And in terms of standards, so I think there isn't a global standard yet, but I think that's what people like B Corp and Future Fit are trying to be. Obviously, they're like maybe 5-10 years away from being big in sort of Asia or potentially kind of South America. They're not quite kind of making it to those places, but that's their overall vision. And I think, we're considering becoming a B Corp. We're considering making that a prerequisite for our businesses, our startups coming through the program, to kind of support that movement. But I think there needs to be a globally recognizable standard like, your fair trade, which is fairly recognized now around the world. And I think that's what the kind of impact investing space needs to move towards. And we all need to kind of support one standard eventually. There has to be one winner.
Yeah, we got to choose something, right? It's better than nothing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, but also people know whether you're abusing, like transparency is growing, right? So whether that's kind of hackers who enforce that or kind of leaks, we are seeing a more transparent world. And so, let's take Boohoo, for example. People see what happened in the factories in Leicester pretty quickly. People know what's happening in Foxconn in China. We're going to see more and more of that. And so there is kind of just, we can say there's a technical standard, a B Corp standard, but there's also just like a human decency standard where we know that this isn't right. Like we know that what Nike was doing with its kind of slave labor wasn't right. And then people kind of put pressure on these companies to change their practices. And that's the world, that's the consumers that are going to be so much more vocal. Like you think millennials and Gen Zs are going to let you get away with it? No way. Not anymore.
Yeah. No, it's changing rapidly and for the better, in most regards. There are two things that you said there that kind of stand out to me. Number one is the fact that we got to rely on hackers and leakers, for us to have any sort of transparency. That's such a pervasive kind of incentive structure. And it's just so weird. How did that ever become commonplace? We would expect that the infrastructure or the systems that we set up would incentivize people to want to be more transparent, but it seems like it's the other way. You want to keep everything hidden and, you can't let the public know too much about what's going on and, coming to that marketing messaging that I mentioned earlier on. And then the second one was, you don't have to tell me about the devaluation of the pound, man. That thing hit like a rock. It was insane. Coming from the United States and coming over here, I was like, oh my goodness, this Brexit thing is really messing me up. But anyway, I just want to make a comment about that. But you have a very interesting background and now you're trying to set up an accelerator. And I can't imagine that's an easy thing to do. Where do you even go to start setting up an accelerator? Do you just say, hey, we need a couple bean bags and a cool spot and let's start to do some cool stuff? Or what are the steps involved in trying to create an accelerator?
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. It's not like a super easy process. That's why people don't do it very often. How do you set it up? I guess you start with some like what I would call founding principles of like, why are we doing it? What's the problem we're trying to solve? So that's how I approached it. So I kind of identified 4 problems and how we're going to solve them. So problem number 1 is that there aren't enough globally scalable kind of impact and very profitable businesses. So we kind of said, right, there aren't enough of them. There's money coming into the space, but there aren't enough to kind of take that cash. So there's a gap. Secondly, they're not very strong brands. So accelerators are typically focused on building great tech and great teams, and they kind of forget that there's a brand behind that, and so they don't really focus on that. My background is kind of 10 years of marketing. We've got Jason on the board, who's the former kind of CMO of Clarks and Nike, and he worked with Alexander McQueen when he was alive. And we've got a partnership with Uncommon, who just won kind of Creative Agency of the Year. They're the kind of former head team at Gray's London. And so they're creating our brand, and they will help the underlying entrepreneurs kind of build globally scalable brands. So that's kind of the two things. So this is going to be a long answer. But kind of, and then kind of the third main thing that I would talk about is that mental health is a really important thing now for entrepreneurs. And I think historically there was this kind of bravado of, founder burnout. You work really hard, like it's really bloody difficult to do what you're doing. Like if you crash and burn, that's fine. Like it's actually kind of like a statement of honor. And I think that is just not the modern world anymore. So the young people particularly are really aware of that. And what struck me as really interesting is that when you're a VC fund and you invest into an entrepreneur, there isn't very much care taken into that actual human behind that. So they just kind of look at you as a kind of, as an asset, right? But actually, if your entrepreneur is stressed out, if they're burnt out, if they don't know how to deal with the kind of pressure that comes with running a business, then your whole investment is in danger. So what we do is we work with entrepreneurs to build resilience is what we call it. So it's kind of got three parts to it, but we help them effectively what I call become great lobsters. So if you know how lobsters...
What, a lobster?
Become great lobsters. So the way lobsters grow is like they have to break through their shell every time they grow. And so that's a painful process for lobsters. And entrepreneurs go through the same thing, right? They have to like make their first hires, make their first 50 hires, grow internationally, etc. So they go through that similar growth phase, but we're going to just train them how to make that process slightly less painful.
Yeah, no, that's deep, man. That hit home. I'm going to save that quote for sure, man. You're like a lobster going through different stages. Did you learn that in like the Himalayan mountains while you're meditating or something like that?
I was there. That's not how I found it, but yeah.
Oh man, that's so interesting. Is there anything that you learned? Because I mean, you're a pretty audacious guy. You ran, for a member of parliament at some point in your life. Is there anything you learned from that you're translating into this now? Because I imagine there's a lot of organization, messaging, there's so many factors involved with what you're trying to do now. Walk me through that process of running for, MP. And is there anything you learned from that you can translate into sort of the business world, what you're trying to do here?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. That's a good one. I think there's a lot of pressure when you run for parliament. So I think when you're an entrepreneur and you're a leader of a business, like people look to you to lead in the right way. And I think when I was running for parliament, you have kind of teams of 5, 10, 50 people, 100 people, 1,000 people looking at you in a debate, and you're constantly on. You have to make sure that you're kind of representing the message, that you're acting in the right way as a leader. And that's not something I experienced before, but now I have to in this business. And it's something just to be really aware of that, we set an example as leaders. And that's obviously quite an obvious statement, but actually being in that position and taking that responsibility quite seriously, kind of means I have to be mindful of how I'm behaving. And I think, historically I've always worked for other people, but now you've got to kind of step up to that. And that's exciting and that's fun. And that's something that politics would teach you. And then the second thing is about idealism versus pragmatism.
Oh, yes.
So I ran as a Labour candidate. I was strongly against Brexit. I had pretty strong views about pretty pro-immigration. I just thought, kind of felt really uncomfortable about where the country was going. And you're kind of sitting there talking to people on the doorstep who strongly disagree with you. They feel the complete opposite, actually. And you've got to find a way to kind of, if you can move them even like an inch, then I think you've done something, right? Like you're trying to move them more. And that's the same as when we're trying to influence the whole investment industry. We're trying to influence the kind of corporate structures and ways of being. And so I think, look, if I can get Procter & Gamble, or if I can get Sony to just act 5% more ethically because they see these startups who are coming through, who are taking them on, and actually, they want to kind of move a little bit towards that space, then brilliant. I'm super happy if everyone just moves slightly. So that's that kind of pragmatism that I've got a little bit of.
Yeah, I'll take any little inch I can get, along the way, whether it's in, I don't want to say negotiations or even trying to convince people, but as long as you're moving the needle overall direction in a certain way, then at least you're making some impact in terms of what you want to see happen in the world and things like that. But no, that's very interesting, man. I don't think there are many people that have made that jump from, trying to be an MP to trying to be an entrepreneur and all that. That's pretty interesting. But how did you know when you were ready for that step up to actually become a leader? That's something that I don't say I've struggled with, but you almost have to see yourself as a leader before you can actually do it, because you have to have that faith and conviction that I can be a leader, right? The first thing is I can, and then you actually do, right? There's a quote or saying somewhere where it's, if you say I can or if you say I can't, you're right either way, right? Because it all depends on your personal sort of manifestation and what you're thinking. Yeah. But what were some of those indicators that let you know I was ready to be a leader, or I have enough conviction in what I'm doing that I'm able to stand in front of people to present, and make myself vulnerable, because leadership is vulnerability, right? I mean, you're open to 1,000 people criticizing you making the wrong decision, all the consequences. What were some of those indicators that you figured out that were like, you know what, I think I'm ready for this. I think I can do this. You know what I mean?
That's a funny question. I mean, really honestly, I didn't know if I was ready, and I don't think I probably was. I think that it just happened. I was basically, I kind of made this deal with the world. I was like, look, I don't want to do this business thing for a little while now. I want to do something in this political space because of what's happening. And I felt very, very strongly, like I really, really kind of felt our country was kind of going in the wrong direction. And I'm an immigrant to the country, and I kind of benefited massively from kind of the old structures that I saw under Labour. And I thought, if someone comes to this country now, they're not going to have the same opportunities that I had. And I think, if you come in, you climb the ladder and then you pull it up behind you, I think that's a pretty bad thing to do. Like that doesn't feel very good. And I didn't want to be that kind of person. And so, I felt very strongly in the cause. And so I think I didn't feel like I had personal leadership, but I felt like I had a very, very strong cause that I was going in to bat for. And so I think that's the same in this situation here. Like, I'm not somebody who's been in VC for 20 years, right? I'm not a founder with a successful exit. I'm someone who's kind of experienced the startup world. But I have a very strong conviction about what needs to change within the VC, within the kind of corporate structures. And so I think if you can find a mission, that can be a fairly good substitute until you kind of learn the ropes of your industry. Because if you're that driven, you're going to work really, really hard to be successful and to make it work. So, you can rely on that.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. I had a similar sort of experience in my life as well, where you're sort of called to leadership, if that makes sense. It's sort of, it's weird. You have to sort of believe in yourself to a certain extent, but I think there's a mission or a cause that you'll see that's so important that you feel almost compelled, right? And you kind of get pulled into that position. Exactly. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh man, all right, I'm actually a leader in this space. People look to me for direction in this. But it's sort of it's weird because oftentimes you see the best leaders are not people that even wanted to be leaders, right? They were kind of just put in that position. You see people that are offered CEO positions and they decline it like 3 or 4 times, until people are like, come on, we really need you here. You know what I mean? But it's such an interesting thing. It's sort of like you're pulled or you're called towards leadership, just based on the fact you see something that's so important to you, that you resonate with. And I guess as part of your accelerator, you're looking for CEOs and founders that have such a drive and calling towards a particular mission. Right. How are you going to marry those two things together? Because the CEO or founder might have one thing that they want to do, but you guys have a certain remit of the types of investments you're looking at. I don't know if it's specific sectors or verticals or whatever it is, but is there ever a time when the CEOs or the founders that are coming with their sort of mission that they want to bring to the world, versus the missions that you actually want to bring to the world, or the visions that you want to bring to the world? How are you going to marry those two? Or is it going to be a case of literally leaving the CEO? What is your vision? Yeah. Because you're so passionate about it, we're going to go with that idea. You know what I mean? Right.
Yeah, exactly. So we're sector agnostic, but we do want to focus on the more B2C space, because that's where a brand is really important. And actually that's where the demand is. So consumers are the ones that are actually driving the more ethical kind of debate, right? So consumers want to buy from ethical brands. So it lends itself more to B2C brands. And so we have a slight lean towards that, but it's not kind of, we don't segment or kind of say no to people. We look for really driven founders. We look for people who are just got amazing visions, who've got big visions. We are not scared by someone who's got what some people call like unrealistic visions for tomorrow. And I think we actually encourage that. We want people with the biggest possible visions. And part of our process is to push people to have bigger visions. So we talk about globally scalable businesses. We're not looking at just European or UK based. And so we're building our investment space from American investors, Chinese investors, European investors, because we want these entrepreneurs to make change at a global level. So we want the bigger the vision, the better. And we want people who believe in it. Yeah. I had a question for you when you talk about kind of being called to something, because I certainly can relate to that. And people have then said afterwards, oh, you're so courageous to do that. But in that moment, it doesn't really feel like courage because you're kind of being called. And I was wondering what your experience was of that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's kind of weird, but you find that courage somewhere, if that makes sense. There's no particular moment, but you just feel that this is such a hole or a gap that I have to fill it. Someone has to do something about it. And you kind of look around the room and you're like, wait, all right, no one else is going to do this? All right, crap, I'm the guy that has to, you know what I mean? All right. And I don't see it as courageous. I don't see it as something odd, because courage invokes sort of feelings or sentiments of externality, like you're bringing in courage from somewhere else, if that makes sense, right? Like, oh, you see something else and it gives you courage, or, you know, you see someone that does something amazing and it gives you courage. I kind of don't see it that way. It's not an external thing. It comes internally. And it's sort of a step up in your way of thinking. That's kind of like, oh man, I got to do this. You just get pulled into it, and you don't actually think that I'm being courageous. You're just doing something that needs to be done, and inadvertently, it's viewed externally as you're being courageous, if that makes sense.
Exactly.
It's not an external thing at all, really. It's just an internal. You're pulled into something. But yeah, I just saw one of the things I'm thinking of is actually at the company I work at. We founded like an African American UK ancestry network or whatever it is, just because of the whole Black Lives Matter initiative. And I saw that no one was really doing much about it, and I was like, I got to step into this. I got to do something, you know, because it's such a powerful movement. You know, we have an opportunity. We have a couple months really before the world forgets about this.
Exactly.
Like, you know, something else to do something. And even if I don't see the benefits, my kids might see the benefits, you know, so let's do something like that. I imagine you feel something similar as well, where it's like, I want to do something now because we have a window of opportunity. Right. Do you ever feel that sort of pressing urgency around what you're doing?
Exactly. Yeah, I can totally relate to that. And I have huge respect for you for doing that, because I think you do have a platform, and you're also working in quite a prestigious, well-known organization. So changes that you make are going to make quite a big impact potentially. Like, you've got that opportunity in front of you. So I think that's awesome to do that, and inspiring for other people. So I think that's great. And yeah, I think it's like, I like this idea of like the moment calls you. And I think that's what I felt when Brexit happened. And I think, Corona and what happened now, I think there is a moment, whether it's Corona or Black Lives Matter, there is kind of the pieces are up in the air, and we do have a choice about how we reassemble the new world. And I think, I'm excited about bringing together people who are passionate about reassembling it in a slightly better way, a more equitable way for everyone.
Yeah, I completely agree, man. As a kid growing up, I would see the structures of the way the world was. And, I always wondered, why do people sort of just follow blindly what's already been? Why can't we decide to look at it from a different angle? Maybe we didn't always have to commute for an hour and a half to get into London. I thought that as a kid even, I was like, this is so bizarre. This is so strange, It's crazy that it took a cataclysmic event like Corona to really change our mindset. But it takes a certain sense of bravery to be able to do that, to actually challenge the status quo, put your professional self out there, put your credibility on the line to even want to change these things before it becomes popular and everyone's like, oh yeah, of course we should do this. You
Absolutely.
know what I mean?
Yeah. Have you tried to do things before and they've just not worked out? Like, people have sort of rejected them. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, I have. And it's because people I think, gravitate towards comfort and the familiar, right? So anything that breaks out of that silo, especially if you're a particular, I don't want to say political background or proclivity, but anything that breaks out of that, it's hard for them to adjust to, right? It's kind of like, ooh, that's the unknown, the scary unknown. But I embrace the unknown, man. Do you know what I mean? I'm kind of like an adventurer, like a rebel in that regard. It's like, I don't know, let's see where the chips fall as they may, you know what I mean? Can't get much worse than this, you know what I mean? So it's like, let's actually go for it. Let's try it out. And I think that's partly what pushes humanity forward, right? That's we have to be bold and willing to try new things, without which we wouldn't have half the stuff we have today. We wouldn't be as advanced. We wouldn't have human rights. We wouldn't have any of these things. So, someone has to take that leap of faith. Someone has to try it out. And it doesn't always work. You always hear about the success stories. You never hear about, the failures that happened along the way. But actually, speaking of failures, what are some of the failures that you really learned from along your path so far?
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. I like to ask that as an interview question.
Yeah.
What's the failure you learned from the most?
Yeah.
That's a good one. I think this touches on the question that you asked earlier, actually. So I set up an NGO to work with the Israel-Palestine conflict like 4 years ago. And we had this big vision. It was like a 15-year program, and we were raising money for it. So we had an offer to kind of fund the whole foundation. And in the last minute, the kind of charity partner we were working with pulled out. And for them, the vision was so big, and they were actually worried when it came down to it. They were like, okay, so we're going to have kind of presidents and prime ministers on our property, kind of doing talks. We're going to have the next generation of leaders from Israel and Palestine. What if something goes wrong? The reputation of this charity could just, we've spent 10 years building this charity. What if something goes wrong? And someone, something happens. And so for them, the vision was actually so big that they rejected it in the end. And they said to me, look, we can either make it smaller, compromise on your vision a little bit, or we can't do it. It's too big. And it was the day we had the money. It was the day that it was actually a big private equity firm who offered us the money to do this as part of their foundation. And I chose to not compromise on the vision and said, right, it's either this vision or nothing. And then, 4 years later, nothing's happened. So what's my lesson there? It's, pick your partners well, number one. and number two, kind of, is something better than nothing? And that's the big question I debate now. Do we stick to this really pure vision with what we're doing? Or do we have somewhere in the middle that we kind of compromise? So maybe the businesses are not kind of Greta green. Maybe they're kind of slightly less than Greta, but they're still on their way.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of big lesson I took from that.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Wow, it's flown by.
Where can people find out about you?
Yeah, so we're launching our brand, but I'm on LinkedIn, Orr Vinegold, and we're kind of launching our brand in the next 3 weeks.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so I'm coming to work in it. Yeah.
Sounds good. Cheers.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Pleasure.